Hello, this is Christian Perring, and here I am to talk about Chapter 6 of the textbook on Kantian Deontology. Kantian refers to the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and as you see here, his dates were 1724 to 1804. So basically, he was working at the end of the 18th century, and he was German, although the part of Germany that he was in is no longer part of Germany. It's actually a sort of little outcrop of Russia now, and it's Königsberg, and it was a very kind of well-known area, very prominent part of the German Empire. So we're going to be talking about Joseph Kranak's chapter, and it's a useful little chapter. I guess I would say that basically the attitude he takes is like, oh yeah, Kant was so great, and here is his ideas, and then here are all the problems with his ideas, which leaves it a little unclear exactly what's so great about Kant, because it seems like all his ideas had big problems with them. But we'll talk about that too. Much of what we'll be talking about is regarding his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. This word deontology gets thrown around a lot. Basically, it comes from the Greek word dion, and it just means duties. So the basic idea is that it approaches morality as a set of duties. And those duties are set out as moral rules. Now that's kind of interesting because obviously there are moral rules, but there are also ways of thinking about morality which go beyond moral rules, I guess. So not contradicting moral rules, but to say that sometimes something's not obligatory, but it's still good to do it. An obvious example may be giving to charity. We think that you don't have to give to charity, but if you do that, then it's a good thing. Now, there is another technical term which is used to describe that category, which is supererogatory. And that simply means going above the call of duty. And maybe there are other parts of morality too, in addition to those two, but those are kind of two big ones. We'll mainly be thinking about duties, but when it comes to morality, I think stuff like being kind, being considerate, being helpful to people. This is a big question whether those are duties that we need to carry out with respect to everybody, or whether maybe you have a duty to be kind to some people, and then it's going above and beyond to be kind to other people. So that's an interesting sort of discussion. Now there is this phrase which we'll be coming to called categorical imperative. One thing to say about that is that sometimes authors make a distinction between the general categorical imperative, which is simply means which is basically a rule which says you should always do something, and then the Kantian categorical imperative, which is sometimes spelt with a big C and a big I in order to kind of really spell it out. So we'll be talking about the Kantian categorical imperative. Kant's view is quite distinctive and quite odd, I think. He doesn't really think that there's any separate category of morality from other regular action. He just thinks that morality is rational action. So all morality is going to be rational, and all rationality is going to be moral. He just thinks that we have to live a rational life. Why do we have to live a rational life? Because that's our nature, really. That's and basically it's the idea of rationality is such a wonderful thing. So his view of rationality is also very distinctive, and it's kind of quite rigid, I think. He thinks that rationality is a system of universal laws that govern our behavior. And like laws of nature, there's no exceptions to those laws. So he just thinks that that's the way rationality is. So we have to obey the laws of rationality because they're laws of nature, really. Another distinctive, and maybe the most important thing is that the laws of rationality, unlike the laws of kind of science, come from within. That is, we give those laws to ourselves as rational agents. I think that kind of phrase is a little bit sort of confusing, but the basic idea is it's not some kind of God or some kind of external agent who gives us laws. It's that we as rational agents want to be ruled by rationality, so we give ourselves those laws. But the laws are essentially rational, so we don't have any choice. And he thinks that everybody is going to come up with the same rational laws, even though we all give our laws to ourselves. This idea that we have to be living according to universal laws of how we should behave seems very rigid, but that's definitely what he thinks. And so laws like you shouldn't kill, or don't steal, or you ought to help those in need are kind of universal laws. And they're independent of any other thing that's going on in your life. So there's a question like, how do we come up with these laws? And that's what the categorical imperative, with the, as I said before, like the big C and the big I, that's what the categorical imperative is meant to show. And it's set out in 3 formulations. So that's what we're going to go through. With the first formulation of the categorical imperative, the way that Kant sets it out is pretty kind of discussed by everybody. And here's his words, at least in the English translation: act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So now we're familiar with the idea that you should live according to universal laws. Now, maxim is a sort of technical word. It just means kind of a rule. And so the basic idea is we should kind of find a rule that can be universal laws. One thing that Kant seems to be assuming is that there is only one universal law which will apply to any particular situation. So it's not like you're going to have 2 different universal laws which give you different directions, which would be kind of confusing or would give you a dilemma. Rather, he thinks, there's just only going to be one universal law which applies. Exactly what his justification for assuming that there's only going to be one is not at all clear. It's actually kind of tricky to rule out more than one. But that's what he is assuming. So then the question becomes, how do we know what these universal laws are? And the basic idea is, if it's possible for a law to be universal, then it won't lead to any contradictions. It'll be feasible to have that universal law. So what does it mean to be not feasible to have a universal law? Well, again, Kant himself is actually extremely unhelpful. And in various examples, he seems to have different ideas. He seems to be kind of mixing different ideas up. But the basic idea is that the idea is the universe wouldn't make sense if for some universal laws. So as the example here is, suppose that you are borrowing money from a friend with no intention of paying your friend back, but you promise to pay your friend back. So you're making a lying promise. So then the idea is, well, if you universalize that, then it would be okay for everybody to make lying promises. Well, what's the problem with that? Is that then lying promises wouldn't mean anything, because promises wouldn't mean anything. If everybody just makes a promise without actually carrying through with it, then making a promise won't actually achieve anything. Nobody will believe you when you say you promise. So now that's not a kind of sort of consequence, a bad consequence. That's simply, it's more than that. It's saying actually be a certain incoherence or inconsistency to the whole thing you're imagining. It's not even a possible world where everybody makes lying promises. So that's Kant's idea. Now, it's actually very kind of difficult to find clear justifications for lots of common universal laws, such as don't lie. I guess the basic idea is, well, if everybody lied, then there wouldn't be possible to even have any communication, because we would never believe each other. I guess my point is this, that, I mean, suppose we restrict it to cases such as, suppose we imagine a universal law such as it is permissible to lie when you will save a life by doing so. Is that universalizable? Well, I mean, I can't see any problem in universalizing it, but Kant seems to assume that there's something totally wrong with lying, because then everybody's going to lie. But if you restrict down the rule, then it's not really a problem. So what this means is that there are big problems with Kant's approach of trying to justify universal rules. As Kranak points out, there's also another consequence of this approach, is that it seems to rule out kind of things that seem perfectly fine. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with them, but because they couldn't be universalized, then the Kantian approach seems to show that they would be immoral, or say they are immoral. So here's the example, is a stamp collector might live by the maxim, I will buy but not sell stamps in order to expand my collection, and everyone try to follow this, then it would be impossible to actually buy, because nobody would be selling. So it seems that form of stamp collecting would be immoral. I was like, well, that's just ridiculous, isn't it? So it's something kind of just deeply misconceived about Kant's approach. I mean, maybe if you have a more realistic conception of rationality, it will make more sense. On the other hand, maybe there's just something deeply wrong about Kant's approach. Kant's view is that we have to live by these rational laws, And he's even kind of more strict than that. He says it's not just that you live by them, but that's that's the reason why you have to act. Like, you have to be doing your actions from duty, from the desire to be rational, not from the desire to help anyone or because you feel close to somebody, or that you love someone, or that you have emotions. All of that, on Kant's view, is totally undermining our rationality, and the only good reason to want to do anything is out of your desire to be rational. Seems like a very kind of specialized notion of morality, and in some ways quite removed from our ordinary conception. As Kranak says, Arthur Schopenhauer was totally kind of dismissive of Kant. He said Kant's position is a deed must be performed simply and solely out of regard for the known law and for the concept of duty. It must not be performed from any inclination, any benevolence felt to another, any tender-hearted sympathy, compassion, or emotion of the heart. And kind of Schopenhauer's take on that is like, well, he's just kind of, he hasn't even understood morality. This takes us to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, big C, big I, which Kant says, oh, yeah, it's the same as the first one, just a different way of doing it. It's not at all obvious that it is, actually. Seems to lead to somewhat different results. And in some ways, I think the second formulation is a better one. It's basically the idea that we should show respect to people. It's often called the principle of humanity. So it's phrased in this way in the English translation: act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Now, this distinction between treating somebody as an end and treating somebody as a means to an end is an important one. But and it's basically the idea is that you shouldn't just use people, rather you should treat people with respect. And treating somebody with respect is a matter of respecting their rationality. But exactly what it means to respect somebody's rationality isn't entirely clear. I mean, I guess it's partly about giving them enough information so they can make a decision. But it doesn't seem to be necessarily about politeness or expressing views which they, if you express views which they find offensive, is that showing respect? Or is that not showing respect? So there's a lot of kind of vagueness about exactly what it means to treat somebody as an end, i.e. as a kind of a fully human subject. And Kant, you won't be surprised to learn, doesn't actually explain it a whole lot. So we can see that, if you lie to somebody, that seems to be using them, especially if you lie to them for your own purposes. But even if you lie to them so that they don't feel so bad, if you're giving them false information, then it seems that you are kind of using them, even if it's for their own good. And if you steal somebody from something, well, that seems to be a kind of showing some kind of disrespect, although exactly why that's disrespectful, Kant needs to do some explanation for that. I mean, if you're taking somebody's property without their permission, then you're violating their autonomy. And I guess that's actually a big part of the second formulation, that people should have control over their own lives. And if you do something which violates their control, then you are not respecting them. So theft, or maybe even interfering with their actions, can be a kind of violation of self-control, and therefore is not treating somebody as an end in themselves. Kant also emphasizes this idea that we have to respect ourselves, and we have to respect our own rationality. And so that means we shouldn't give in to all sorts of temptations and desires, because then you're not being rational, rather you're just giving in. So it leads him to kind of have all sorts of duties to oneself as well as to others. Our text has a little kind of side box on suicide. Certainly the predominant religious view is that suicide is immoral, and that was defended also by people like Thomas Aquinas, who said that a life is intrinsically valuable, and so it's wrong to go against life. And Kant says suicide is immoral because it's using yourself. It's not respecting yourself. You're treating yourself as an object rather than as a subject. But it seems actually that argument is not really very convincing. Certainly if you take the example of somebody who is in terrible suffering and has no way to end that suffering, and their life is just not worth it to them, then why would it be kind of using yourself to end your life? It's like, well, no, it seems to be a rational thing because your life has no purpose, and so Kant's argument there just doesn't make a lot of sense. You can certainly have a universal rule that it's permissible to end your life when your life is nothing but suffering, and that suffering can never be alleviated or ended. So it doesn't seem at all plausible that there should be a universal prohibition against suicide on a Kantian approach. Kant's emphasis on rationality means that he thinks that humans have rationality and non-humans don't. And he thinks there's a kind of absolute divide between humans and non-humans. And he thinks since rationality is like the source of value and respect, then there is no reason to respect non-humans, and there is no reason to value them. So the fact that they experience pain if you treat them badly is of no moral consequence on his view. So it's a pretty dismal approach to animals. He seems to just think, you can do whatever you like. And there's, I guess, one of the weird consequences of his view is then, well, what about humans who don't have rationality? And there's different ways you can lack rationality. I mean, in some ways we all lack rationality when we're asleep because we're sleeping. We're not kind of responding to the world around us. But maybe so it seems like, well, yeah, that doesn't count. You don't stop counting when you're asleep. So having rationality must be something you can do from day to day, even if you don't actually have or show rational behavior at a particular time for it, because if you're asleep. Similarly, if you're drunk, you're not going to be rational. But that doesn't mean you don't have any value. It seems that you kind of will get over your drunkenness. Then there's kind of a more permanent lack of rationality in babies and young children. Babies and young children are they have a basic rationality as they want food and they want sleep and they want to avoid discomfort, but they can't understand a damn thing. So they lack rationality in those ways. And it's not like they're going to wake up the next day and suddenly be rational. No, it's a pretty long-term lack of rationality. In fact, young humans are lacking rationality for just as long as many non-humans are even alive. So, what does Kant want to say about that? Well, he doesn't really say anything. He doesn't really address the issue. but then we can look at humans who definitely lack rationality and will never get it. I guess obvious examples are people who are in a permanent coma. They're never going to wake up. And then maybe people who have severe neurological problems which are incurable. And they are unable to, say, use language in any form. And it seems like they also lack rationality. So it seems like, at least for some of those people I've just discussed, and it's not exactly clear how many of them, depending on how you understand the idea, well, you could be rational in some way if things were a bit different, then at least for some of them, they just lack rationality, even more so than kind of other mammals. You know, if you're in a coma, you totally lack rationality, whereas if you are a kind of a squirrel trying to kind of get some nuts from a bird feeder, you are quite determined, and you show all sorts of kinds of rationality. So kind of it seems that Kant's view implies that at least some humans also have no moral value. And that's an implication which many people find highly problematic, because they want to say all humans have value. And it would certainly be wrong to start like cutting people in comas up just to get their organs. So Kant's view there is just highly problematic. And the idea that we can just say what counts as rationality and only rational creatures have value, that doesn't seem very plausible. Our textbook also points out another problem with the second formulation, that it seems that it doesn't count some things as wrong which seem to be pretty obviously wrong. There are plenty of cases where other people aren't involved, so you're not showing disrespect to people, but we still think there's a problem. So he uses the example of the destruction of the natural world through carelessness or negligence. He says, if I accidentally start a forest fire by setting off fireworks when there is a high fire risk, aren't I morally culpable? Now, but you're not using another person as a means, you're not showing disrespect, you're causing a forest to be destroyed. Now, Kant may say forests don't count, and if no people are hurt or endangered, then there is no problem with destroying a forest. That seems kind of a bit weird, but maybe there's some plausibility to it. The idea that all that really counts are humans, and it's only really if humans are disrespected by destruction of nature that we should worry about it. So it's an interesting example, but it's not clear that it's the best one. Now he gives another example, which again is a little bit kind of weird. He says, what about respecting the dead? Dead people don't have rationality, so it doesn't seem like they count. But he says, if my mother wanted to be given a Christian burial and instead I simply left her body out in the woods, that would seem to be quite immoral. But how do we explain that in terms of treating her as mere means? And the question of respecting dead people is a kind of curious one. I'm not quite sure what we want to say about it. So it is a kind of a conundrum that's worth thinking about. And the general message is that there are definitely inadequacies in Kant's second formulation. Kranak briefly discusses the third formulation of the categorical imperative, big C, big I. And he does it briefly because in some ways it's the most confusing. Some scholars find it very interesting, but it's certainly not very obvious. He says, act in accordance with the maxims of a member giving universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. Now, what's confusing about that is, well, what does he mean by a kingdom of ends? Kant says, I understand a systematic union of various rational beings through common laws. So the idea is you're not just operating on an individual basis, but rather you're operating in a kind of society, I guess. So everybody is interconnected, which is all very interesting, but exactly kind of what kind of society are we thinking about? And it's all massively vague. And the basic idea is that people should be free to live their lives they want, and it undermines people's autonomy if you interfere with them too much. So, I mean, that is a good lesson to take from the third formulation, and it fits in very well with both the first formulation and the second formulation. But it's not clear that it adds very much to our understanding. As I mentioned earlier on, and nearly near the start of this presentation, Kranak's position is that Kant's ethics have been very influential, even though they seem to suffer huge problems. There are some ideas there which seem worth exploring. Other parts just don't seem to work. So there is a question like, well, why is Kant such a big deal if basically none of it really adds up to much? And I find that a pretty big question. I can't really give you a good answer to that one. But I think we do take the idea of morality as duties seriously, and it's worth exploring, even if Kant's approach has been pretty hopeless.